Notice how in today's gospel reading, it lists off some of the women who followed our Lord, and one of them was Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Now, the occasion on which these demons had come out of her is not recorded in the scriptures, so we don't know a whole lot about it. But it is nevertheless revealed to us that there were 7 demons in her. Whether she was fully possessed is also debatable. So, full diabolical possession is the greatest form of diabolical activity, but there can be lesser degrees of demonic influence on a person, such as diabolical obsession or diabolical oppression. So in the case of both of those, the person is not fully possessed, but the demons are present. They can harass the person. In the case of diabolical oppression, a person can suffer physical ailments. Nothing seems to go well for them. They're just prone to depression, and they're just very, very miserable. But the demons don't fully possess the person. In the case of diabolical obsession, what happens is the demons cause the person to have ongoing obsessive thoughts or even inclinations that are sometimes rationally absurd, but the person just can't seem to get these thoughts out of their mind. And it's not so much the person, but it's the demons who are causing these things to happen. So in the case of Mary Magdalene, we don't know if it was full diabolical possession or one of these other forms of slightly lesser forms of demonic influence. The fact that it mentions that there were 7 is rather significant. Now, it could have been any number. Recall the demoniac who, when our Lord asks for them to reveal their name, they say that we are legion. So it's like a huge amount. And when they asked to be allowed to go into the herd of swine, I think it was 3,000 swine. So there were at least 3,000 demons in that person. So it could have been any number. Sometimes it's only one demon that possesses a person. But the number 7 is quite significant. So we have 7 sacraments. But we also have 7 deadly sins, or the 7 capital sins. And it's good for us to review them. And sometimes exorcists have pointed out that the demons, when they reveal their identity, they will reveal different names, some of which, we're quite familiar with. But sometimes they will reveal things like they are a particular vice, such as the spirit of lust, which is very interesting. So in other words, certain demons, their main task is to incline certain individuals to lust or anger or one of these other vices. And so this brings us to the fact that, well, these 7 demons could theoretically represent the 7 capital sins. So it's good for us to review them. A good way to remember the 7 capital sins is the phrase or the wording pale gas, P-A-L-E-G-A-S, pale gas. So pride, anger or wrath, lust, envy, gluttony, avarice or greed, and sloth. And it would be good for us to kind of review each one of those and to spend time on each one and to consider how we are all prone to each one of these 7 deadly sins. Interestingly enough, St. Thomas Aquinas, when he talks about the 7 deadly sins, or the 7 capital sins, he points out that the reason they're called capital sins is because they are the source of all other sins. They are not mortal sins in and of themselves, but they usually lead a person into mortal sin. But St. Thomas, instead of calling them 7 capital sins or 7 deadly sins, he calls them the 7 deadly vices. And that's interesting that he calls them vices instead of sins. And he has an insight that's worthwhile for us to reflect on. So a vice is the opposite of a virtue. So what is a virtue? A virtue is a habit that inclines us to do the good and to be able to carry out the good in a sufficient way. So in other words, a person who has a habit, who has a virtue, can do the good easily. So a vice is the opposite of that. So a vice is also a habit, a disposition, that inclines a person to do evil, and it also inclines them to do it easily. So there's some similarities, but they are opposites. So virtue is for the sake of doing good. Vice is for the sake of doing evil. So a person who has a virtue or a good habit isn't always exercising that habit. But when the opportunity arises, they do. Or when the need arises, they do. In like manner, the person who has a vice doesn't mean they're constantly committing that vice. But when the opportunity or the temptation arises, they just very easily give in to that vice. So the reality is that you and I, we probably occasionally give in to a certain degree to one of these 7 deadly vices, whether it's pride or sloth or gluttony or whatever it may be. But it doesn't mean that we necessarily have the vice just because we occasionally give in to that particular sin. So, in other words, we acquire the vice when we repeat the sin again and again and acquire the habit of the vice. And this is where the real danger comes in. Because once we've acquired that vice, it's very easy for the evil spirits to tempt us and to lead us into sin. So how are habits acquired? How are vices acquired? Through repetition. It's very simple. So if we want to acquire good habits, well, we need to perform good actions. The more good actions we perform, the more we will have the virtue of doing good. Not just in one area, but in all other areas. Spiritual authors point out that all the vices are interconnected and all the virtues are interconnected. So spiritual authors usually recommend, pick your dominant vice or your dominant inclination to sin and try to work against it really, really hard. And at the same time, try to acquire the opposite virtue. And simply by working on your most dominant sinful inclination or vice and the opposite virtue, you will be growing in all the virtues, and you will be able to conquer all of your vices. And once you've conquered that main vice or main inclination to sin, well, move to the next one and then to the next one. And over time, we can become great saints if we do this. So we all have many bad inclinations, and I've read accounts where saints or spiritual authors say, if you were able to remove one vice from your life every single year, just one vice every single year, by the end of your life, you would be a saint. So the part of that message is that it's not so easy, because bad habits, once they're acquired, they're difficult to break. But with the grace of God and doing the right things, we can overcome them. God gives us the grace to do that. God gives us sufficient grace to avoid any and all mortal sins. But we have to cooperate with that grace. We have to be doing the right things. Otherwise, we're developing bad vices. And it's also important to keep in mind, I mentioned focus on your dominant vice or sinful inclination, but it's important to note that we need to be mortified in every area of our lives, because if we're indulging in one area, as I mentioned, all the vices are interconnected. So if we indulge one passion, well, it just leads to the indulgence of the other passions. And these 7 deadly sins are very, very dangerous for us, so it's worthwhile for us to reflect on them. People who hold on to anger, who are unwilling to forgive, sometimes even their own family members, well, they're in the grip of the vice of anger. They are in the grip of the evil spirits. The evil spirits can easily influence them. Or someone who is addicted to pornography or lust or sloth. People think sloth is just laziness, right? Well, spiritual laziness. Well, it's kind of that, but it's really, sloth is really sadness about spiritual things. Sadness about spiritual things. What does that mean? That's the kind of the official definition. Sloth is like sadness regarding spiritual things. It means that you find spiritual things boring. Makes you sad to have to pray the rosary. Oh, do we have to pray the rosary again? That's the kind of the attitude. So it's a kind of aversion to spiritual things because you don't find delight in them. And because you don't find delight in them, you find them boring. And why is it that you don't find delight in these spiritual things? Part of the reason is because you're probably given over to some of the other vices that we just listed off. Sorry. So we need to root out vice, and when we do, we draw closer to God, and so we find delight in spiritual exercises because we realize that it helps us to connect with God. Sometimes we experience the presence of God in our lives, but also if we take our spiritual life seriously, we see that prayer is very, very effective. So, I might go to pray in the morning, which I do every morning, but often prayer is difficult. I don't find any delight in it, but I know it's beneficial for me. And so I do it anyways. And so I'm not sad about it because I know I have to face this struggle. I know I have to face this sometimes kind of darkness or aridity that comes with prayer. But I know I have to do it, so I'm not going to avoid it. A person who lacks this conviction, in other words, they give in to sloth, and they just don't want to do it. They look for opportunities to avoid saying their prayers. Interestingly enough, if you read St. Thomas Aquinas on sloth, he points out that as time goes on, the person who gives in to sloth, they have a greater and greater aversion to prayer as time goes on. And he said that eventually the person ends up hating God. Sloth can lead to hatred of God. It's hard to conceive, but yes, that's what can happen. And so this is why it's so important for us to have a habit, a routine of prayer, whether we feel like it or not. And by persevering in prayer, even though it may be difficult or dry at times, eventually God will give us consolations. God will make us realize how important and beneficial prayer really is. So we really need to think about these 7 deadly sins or 7 deadly vices. In regards to today's gospel reading, I just wanted to point out also that this gospel kind of focuses on these women that followed our Lord and who supported our Lord and his disciples. They made sacrifices in order to be with our Lord. They made sacrifices, they left their homes, but they also made sacrifices to support him and his apostles, like not just, cooking for them, but out of their own expense, out of their own resources, providing for them. And it's a beautiful thing to see that. And we are called to do the same. So how do we support our Lord today? How do we honor our Lord today? There's different things that we could do, but we need to support our Lord in his mission. How do we do that? Well, yeah, we can give to the church, and that's part of it, but we need to do our part also by spreading the word, being the way that God calls us to be. Imagine that you are always with our Lord. How would you act? Imagine you're washing the dishes for our Lord and his 12 disciples. But also in regards to Mass, how do we honor our Lord in the Mass, in the Eucharist? Think, for example, of St. Jean-Marie Vianney in his rectory where he lived. He didn't heat the place. It was a kind of mortification, a kind of embracement of poverty. And he ate very little. In other words, he was constantly fasting. He lived on boiled potatoes, and that was it for a very long time until, when he was older, they kind of forced him to take some milk and maybe a few other things. And he had only one cassock. It was all patched. He would go around in bare feet. He had very little for himself And he slept on the ground. He didn't sleep in a bed. He slept on the ground. So all these mortifications, all these acts of self-denial. But when it came to the liturgy, when it came to the Mass, he wanted the very best. He wanted to get the very best chalice that he could, the very best, the very most beautiful vestments that he could ever find. He wanted to honor our Lord by means of these things. And so we ought to consider, well, what can I do? And I mentioned, dressing up on Sundays. People don't dress up because they see other people don't dress up either. But imagine if everybody dressed up. Well, you would dress up also. So in other words, how do we honor our Lord? How do we support our Lord today? Something for us to think about.